Recently, I've been going back over the works of Jung, and particularly psychological types, obviously, and I have found a number of insights about how Jung conceived his system, which I think are very useful for typology enthusiasts today, so I'm going to be sharing those with you. Number one, our experience of the world is just as much psychological as it is physical. And this is a bit of a conceptual breakthrough for me. While I have already promoted the dichotomy between the subject and objects, I think that Jung, following in the footsteps of previous philosophers, especially Kant, took this concept further than I have. Most of us assume that through our senses we have direct access to the outside world, that our eyes are like windows through which we watch the world, or that our ears are like holes through which we hear the world. In other words, we make the assumption that many of the properties that we perceive to be in objects, such as age, usefulness, sturdiness, beauty, etc., are actually properties belonging to the object, which we are merely perceiving in the object. There is a serious problem with this view, however, which I think is best revealed through an example originally given by the American philosopher William James. Let's say that you own a small lake behind your house, which you like to canoe in or take a boat in. You go down with your dog to do just that, only to discover that the boat is still wet inside from last night's rain. So you say to your dog, "Dog, go up to the house and fetch me a sponge." So the dog runs up to the house and looks around in your house for a sponge, and he searches and searches, and he cannot find a sponge. So the dog returns empty, and the human goes up to the house instead. What does the human get? He gets a towel. Why didn't the dog think to get a towel? Because the dog does not understand what a towel could possibly have to do with a sponge. But we know because we have attributed something to both of those objects, the concept of absorptiveness. That's a purely abstract category. You can't see it, you can't hear it, you can't touch absorptiveness. So where do we get that idea from if it didn't come to us from the object itself? Well, we formed it in our mind, and then we projected that onto our perception of the object. We most certainly perceive the world differently when we attribute billions of these kinds of categories and connections to objects. It's what allows us to build skyscrapers and cars, to create art, or to talk about Jungian typology or make YouTube videos about it. Yet none of the categories that we formed in our minds actually exist tangibly in the world. They don't come to us through our senses. Rather, we read them into our sense perceptions. We add them in ourselves. Hence, the human experience of the world is as much psychologically constructed as it is physically constructed. We don't just perceive the world, we also have to make sense of it. Part of us relies on what reaches us from the physical object. This Jung calls the objective factor. The other part of us, however, relies on what the object, quote, constellates in the subject. This Jung calls the subjective factor. I should make it clear before proceeding, however, that Jung's concept of the, quote, subjective factor was not so comprehensive as I've presented it here. I think it could potentially encompass that, but that's not at least what Jung was talking about. When he refers to the subjective factor, he wasn't really talking about simple utilitarian concepts like absorptiveness. What he was interested in and what he specifically defined as the subjective factor was what he called the collective unconscious and its constituent archetypes, which I'm going to explain presently. Because the second point that I found interesting was that it seems that this psychic world or psychological world corresponds in structure to the physical world. One of Jung's core concepts is the collective unconscious. What he meant by this, as I understand it, was that throughout the entire history of humanity, including our presumed beginnings from the protozoa, each successive generation has been impressed by physical events and objects, which gradually evolved and developed the psychic categories which man now uses to make sense of the world. This psychic structure is passed on genetically, so that each generation builds on what the previous generation learned. The process, like all of evolution, is incredibly gradual and takes many generations before any kind of noticeable change occurs. The point, however, is that Jung did not believe that humans are born as a blank slate, but that we are all born with the collective experiences of the entire history of humanity pre-wired into our psyche. This pre-made structure, which is common to all of humanity, he terms the collective unconscious, or, on occasion, the subjective factor. Jung emphasizes and re-emphasizes the reality of this psychic realm, or subjective factor. For him, it is a dangerous prejudice to regard the physical realm as more real than the psychic realm, just because it's tangible. He makes it very clear that the psychic categories with which we understand the physical world are, for us, just as real as the physical world itself, because the collective unconscious continues through the human genealogy independent of our individual wills, just as the physical world continues through our generations independent of our individual wills. Therefore, when we are born, it is as though we are born into two different parallel realms. Our body, our physical body, is born into the physical realm, while our mind achieves consciousness within the psychic realm of the collective unconscious. As our physical body develops, so too does our ego, or the nexus of our conscious mind. And just as our physical body has certain effects on the physical realm, so too does our ego have an effect on a swath of the collective unconscious, if you want to put it that way, which Jung terms the self. The structure thus becomes something like this. Our body is the same as the ego. Our perceived sphere of influence corresponds with consciousness. Our broader sphere of influence, which we don't normally perceive, corresponds with our personal unconscious. The totality of our influence corresponds with the self. And then the rest of the world corresponds with the collective unconscious. The third point I found very interesting was that extroversion places deciding weight on the objective factor, while introversion places deciding weight on the subjective factor. The Jungian functions independent of the two attitudes are sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition. We make use of all these functions, though our consciousness has distinct preferences in which functions it makes use of. According to Jung, depending on the overall attitude of our consciousness, this colors the preferred function within that attitude, causing it to undergo peculiar modifications, thus producing 8 functions or 8 psychological types. Now, if an introvert punches an extrovert in the face, both individuals will experience the event in essentially the same way. Their senses will transfer what's happening to their minds, and that information will bang around against the individual's ego, personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious, producing different sounds depending on the curvature of those psychic objects. This is obviously a metaphor. I've used many metaphors, but just follow me on this one. Now, extroversion means that while you do hear all those sounds, they are never given enough consideration to override the evidence received directly from the outside world. But introversion, however, means that deciding weight is granted to those sounds produced against the subjective factor, both the personal and the collective. So an easier way to say that is extroversion gives more authority to the information coming from the physical world, while introversion gives more authority to the information stimulated in the psychic world. Jung cautions that if these attitudes are carried to extremes, then they will become nothing but mirrors of the objective or subjective realms respectively, neither process adding anything new to the data. For instance, extroversion would completely ignore its subjective needs, which have accumulated over millennia, until the individual is overtaken by its repressed and now ill-adapted subjective desires. Meanwhile, introversion would ignore the physical reality of the world, which has also developed over millennia, becoming a babbling lunatic who only proclaims the state of the subjective factor to the outside world without adapting that information in any useful way to the present situation. In order for both attitudes to remain healthy, they must concede to the method of the opposing attitude somewhat. Extroversion must abstract general conclusions from the objective data, for instance, making a category like absorptiveness, and introversion must reconcile its subjective ideas with the current objective data, for instance, ensuring that a category absorptiveness actually describes the current world meaningfully. They're very similar but going in different directions. The fourth point that I found very interesting was just as the physical world is already there for extroversion to draw from, so too the psychic world is already there for introversion to draw from. What I mean by that is, in the past I have described introversion as though it still relied on the outside world for its material, and that therefore the only real difference between extroversion and introversion was that they still got their material from the same place, but they got it in different ways. I took for granted the idea of a blank slate, but Jung had a rather different symmetrical conception, which was non-blank slate, more like Noam Chomsky if you're familiar with him. As I've said before in this video, Jung believed that the subjective factor contributes immensely to our understanding of the world, and the fact that humanity shares the same essential subjective factors grants it a reality rivaling that of the physical world. Thus, introversion can act independently of the physical world, for it can draw directly from the well of its personal unconscious or the collective unconscious and bring out concepts by which we all understand the world and grant it meaning, just as extroversion draws its information from a physical reality that we also all share and can draw meaning from. As I've said before, the extroverted functions are ultimately trying to draw conclusions or abstractions from the objective data that reconcile their subject with the object, while introverted functions are ultimately trying to reconcile their subjective ideas with the objective data presented them by the current form of the world, and thus they too are trying to reconcile the subject with the object. They are both ultimately trying to do the same thing, but are from different directions and different focuses. This gives an intriguing taint to the definitions of the functions. And this is not an official redefinition of the functions, it's just another aspect. And also, most of us only experience the first half of these functions, but I think they are still a complete process of trying to reconcile the subject to the object. Extroverted thinking we might call empirical, because it's drawing conclusions from the objective facts, whilst introverted thinking becomes, we might say, rationalistic, because it's trying to give life to pure logical ideas through the objective facts. We see here the dichotomy in philosophy of the empiricists versus the rationalists. We might describe that as the empiricists saying that there is a blank slate and all of our information comes from the outside, whilst the rationalists are saying that there are a priori ideas that are already there in the mind that we use to understand the world. Very much an extroverted-introverted dichotomy. And we see this through the rest of the functions. For instance, extroverted feeling and introverted feeling. For them, I still prefer the words accommodating and individuating, but the new view would specify that extroverted feeling draws conclusions about values and what it should do from the objective feeling atmosphere, while introverted feeling is trying to give life to pure subjective values through the general feeling atmosphere. Then extroverted sensation we might call realistic, or as I've said before, photographic, because it forms its perceptions of the world based on objective sensations, while introverted sensation we might call impressionistic because it's seeking to bring out archetypal subjective sensations by relating them to actual objective sensations. And finally, extroverted intuition we could call enterprising, or for lack of a better word, prospective, because it forms perceptions based on objective possibilities, giving it an actively predictive nature. Meanwhile, introverted intuition we could call prophetic, not an authority. I know that makes them sound like, oh, I'm a prophet, but simply in traditional nature, for lack of a better word, because it seeks to give life to possibilities that it has perceived in the subjective factor, both the collective and the personal, which gives it more of a grand overarching nature than extroverted intuition, but by no means necessarily more accurate. In all of these cases, the main difference between introversion and extroversion is that introversion seems to be trying to flesh out something from the subjective realm and bring it to bear in the real world, while extroversion seems to be trying to take what it's gotten from the real world and find a way to reconcile it with the things that it finds in itself. So those are just some of the main ideas that I've picked up from my rereading of Jung. I'm going to make one or two more of these sort of notes on Jung videos that are some more interesting ideas that I've picked up from reading back over the original Jung, so let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you again very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.